Welcome to Beg to Differ, the Bulwark's weekly roundtable discussion featuring civil conversation across the political spectrum, from center left to center right. I'm Mona Charen of the Ethics and Public Policy Center, and I'm joined by our regulars, Bill Galston of the Brookings Institution and the Wall Street Journal, Linda Chavez of the Niskanen Center, and Damon Linker of The Week. We are delighted to welcome as our special guest this week, Yascha Mounk, an associate professor at Johns Hopkins University, a contributor to The Atlantic magazine, and the founder of Persuasion. So before we move into our first topic, which will be the Trump and the military and the Jeffrey Goldberg article in The Atlantic, Yascha, I'm going to give you an opportunity. First of all, thanks so much for being here. And I want to give you an opportunity to just do a commercial for Persuasion. Tell us what prompted you to found it and why people should be interested.
Well, thank you so much, Mona. And it's really a pleasure to be on this wonderful podcast with, as I was joking before we start to record, all of my friends who I don't get to see because of this damn pandemic. So I think we're in a strange moment in which we are making hopefully real progress on some important things. I think there's real injustices in this country that we are talking about and addressing in a real way at the moment. But I also think that a spirit of fear, a strange intellectual orthodoxy has taken hold of a lot of mainstream American institutions. This is not just about shunning racists or sexists or anti-Semites. It is about narrowing the space of what you can think and how you can talk so much that there's a prescribed opinion on 30, 40, 50 different topics. And any deviance from it has very scary consequences for professors at universities, for journalists at many newspapers and magazines, even, as my reporting has shown, for many ordinary people who end up getting fired from complete normie jobs because they are falsely accused of having done terrible things. And so I think that we need to fight for the values of a free society. We need to fight for the values of free speech. That we need an institution, a publication, a community in which we pledge ourselves to advancing and defending the values of philosophical liberalism. And so about 2 months ago now, I founded this platform called Persuasion. And it's really been wonderful and gratifying how quickly we have grown. Our articles go to tens of thousands of subscribers, and we have some of the best authors in the country writing for us. We are doing really fun and great in-person events, happy hours, ways for people who share this set of philosophical convictions and this set of concerns to connect with us and with each other. So since you told me to advertise, I will make sure to mention the website. It is www.persuasion.community. I feel like I found an intellectual home, people can have multiple intellectual homes. So they can be at home both with you and your crowd and with Persuasion. And I would love for all of the listeners to this podcast to come and join up.
Lovely. I want to just emphasize that the piece you wrote a month or so ago about stop firing innocent people was just terrific. Certainly laid out what is happening and put the lie to the notion that it is only intellectuals or people in universities who are subject to this kind of cancel culture. And you gave examples of a number of just hapless, ordinary folks who got caught up in this. And it was kind of like a mania. And you laid it out beautifully.
Thank you so much.
So much has happened this week since our last podcast that I'm not sure we can fit it all in. But let us begin with the Jeffrey Goldberg article that appeared last Friday, I think, regarding Trump's relationship with the military. Damon, I'll start with you. Filled with all kinds of damning quotations from the president. They were from anonymous sources, but the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic put his own byline on this story, and he has an excellent reputation. And furthermore, the things that were attested to in this piece, such as Trump saying, "Why would I go to that cemetery?" referring to the cemetery where America's World War I dead are interred in France. "It's filled with losers," said Trump. But in any event, it's so consistent, isn't it, with things that we have heard him say in public, right?
Yes, absolutely. That was the bizarre thing about this story, that it at once was completely shocking and totally unsurprising because it's
Mm.
Donald Trump. So it's really just confirming things that he has actually said, not just attributed to him by sources, anonymous or not, but actually on tape before cameras for years. He used to rail against John McCain and said famously during the 2016 campaign that he doesn't like soldiers who've been captured, referring to McCain being a POW and suffering terribly when he was held captive. So, on the one hand, this is just confirmation of what we already know very well and what has been established on the record indisputably about the president. On the other hand, it's so morally shocking that every new example sort of leads you to do a double take. And I think that's sort of what people were going through when the story first came out. I mean, you're reminded, or at least I'm reminded, of these characters in Plato's dialogues, like the sophist Thrasymachus, or a kind of made up sophist who Plato created in the dialogue The Gorgias, named Callicles. These characters who go through life as kind of radical cynics who simply assert over and over again that any sense of higher morals is just delusional. And the reality, if you're hard nosed enough, is to realize that all that counts in life is winning and losing. And so if you volunteer to fight in a war and get killed while fighting, that's not noble. That's not honorable. That's not something that you consider to be valor and admire. That means that you're a sucker. You're a chump. You're a sap because you chose to sacrifice your own capacity to win for losing. And Trump, we are living in a country that has elected a man who actually views the world exactly like this, which is really quite amazing. I mean, the reason why I'm bringing up the Plato reference is not to try to elevate the conversation higher than it ought to be when talking about Donald Trump, but simply to point out that this is nothing new. There have been people who view the world this way as long as there has been human civilization. But the fact that we've elected such a man to be president is astonishing, and we are kind of now lashed to him as he says these things when he's the commander in chief and should be the last person, you would think, in the world who would view the world that way. And yet he does.
Thank you. Linda, so 3,000 years of human civilization right out the window, right? I mean, the values that
Right.
Western civilization and all civilizations, frankly, tend to uphold: courage, valor, selflessness, devotion to duty, all those
Truthfulness.
things, truthfulness. Yeah. Those things, those are for suckers, apparently. And I want you to respond in particular to that, and then also just to this detail that was also in that Atlantic story, that he objected to having wounded veterans at military displays like amputees, because he said nobody wants to see that.
Well, no wonder he is so at home in North Korean company.
Yep.
Kim Il-sung, back when North Korea first went communist, forbade any individuals who had any sort of physical infirmity from living in Pyongyang. And my guess is that's probably still the case today. So that doesn't surprise me. I will tell you one thing that struck me and I thought was very telling. We know that he did not serve. He was a draft dodger. He had these supposed bone spurs, which he claimed prevented him. He had 5 deferments, as I understand it, from serving in the military during the Vietnam era. But what was more striking to me was to learn that no one in Donald Trump's family for generations has served in the U.S. military. His grandfather, who came from Germany, went back to Germany, then Prussia, and decided he could not stay because he was going to be drafted into the Prussian military. So he came back to the United States. His father, Fred, did not serve in the military. He did not serve in the military. And according to Mary Trump in her book, there was actually discussion about what would happen if Don Jr., who apparently did flirt with the idea of joining the military, were to actually enlist. And Mary Trump claims that he would have been disinherited by Ivana and by Donald Trump if he had joined the military. In addition, in the prenuptial agreement that he had with Marla Maples, he was supposed to come up with $100,000 a year in child support, but that would be vacated if his daughter ended up joining the military. So this is a man that not only has never served, but he comes from a community of people that do not value service. And I don't know about you, but I cannot think of a single person in my circle of friends, acquaintances, or family who do not have anyone who has ever served their country during a time of war.
Wow. I did not know some of those details. That is really interesting. Yascha, you know what it reminds me of? In the first Godfather movie and in the book, the Godfather is very put out with his son Michael because Michael is serving in the U.S. Army, not the code of the mafia.
Well, I think there is a strange strain to authoritarian populists like Donald Trump of, valorizing, immorality. It is saying, look, there's all of these elites that are corrupt and that are self-serving, and they hide all of that by pretending to adhere to these standards and norms and so on. But you and I, we're smarter than that, at least street smarter than that, right? We're cleverer than that. We realize that this is all baloney, and that everybody's just in it for themselves, and that we should reject all of these attempts to hold us to these standards. And, elements of that can be quite appealing to citizens in countries around the world. I mean, there's a reason why authoritarian populists have done well, not just in the United States with Donald Trump, but in Hungary and Venezuela and countries around the world, because there is a sense that a lot of people do have that, perhaps there's something to that. Perhaps elites really do sometimes invoke these values without living up to them themselves. Perhaps there is a lot of sort of 4th of July speech making that actually is a little bit superficial. And perhaps we do need somebody who just sort of fights for us. And that has always been part of Trump's appeal. But what's interesting about Trump is how extreme he is in this and how little of a sense he has of, when the appeal of a smart guy who's going to fight for you gives way to horror at the sheer extent of a lack of compassion he seems to have and the lack of patriotism he seems to have. And so I think sometimes those breaches of taboos have worked very well for Donald Trump because they have made people think that he's going to do anything for the people he stands up for, irrespective of the rules. Perhaps sometimes because they've drawn the outrage of people who are generally disliked. And so people, I think, 2016 thought, well, if all of these people dislike Trump, then I guess there must be something to him. There must be something that's okay. But Trump has also, at the same time, really placed himself outside of the cultural mainstream of the United States and really horrified people by the extent to which he seems to lack compassion. And we're seeing that in this story. This is an area in which saying, hey, you know what, going to war and fighting for your country and getting injured is for suckers. It shares that element of amorality, which comes deep from within Donald Trump, I think, but it rightly is horrifying to a vast majority of Americans.
Um, yeah, this is so interesting. Bill, one other aspect of this struck me as funny, that Trump went out on Labor Day, he went out to defend himself after the story. And the way he chose to do it was by saying the generals don't like me, he said, because they want to do nothing but fight wars so that all those beautiful companies that make the bombs and make the planes and make everything else stay happy. And now, first of all, nobody has been a bigger booster of military spending than Trump. Trump is the guy, isn't he, who said he didn't want to pursue any further investigations of how Adnan Khashoggi was killed because Saudi Arabia buys so many military, so much military equipment from us. But also, it just struck me that that kind of talk about the military is they're only in it for the money, they're only in it to they want endless wars and so on. I mean, you couldn't have asked for a more perfect sort of left-wing critique of American policy, right, coming out of the mouth of Trump.
Oh, look, this conversation is almost like piling on at this point, and I'm tempted to invoke the old legal principle, res ipse loquitur.
Yes.
The thing speaks for itself. What more can we say? But having denied that there's anything more left to say, I will now proceed to say it. Two brief points. First of all, it's bad enough that this mentality infects all of the domestic politics that Trump touches. But what is even worse, in my opinion, is the way that it leads directly, ineluctably, to the principle of moral equivalence between and among nations. And so a standard international consequence of Trump's amoral cynicism is the belief that, well, we shouldn't be criticizing other countries for doing bad things because we're just as bad.
Yep.
Right? So it deprives him of any basis, even if he were of a mind, to criticize the immoral, murderous, genocidal conduct of other nations. It deprives him of any basis to do so. Okay, point number two, and this is going to surprise you. If it were not for the fact that Donald J. Trump has inflicted so much damage on the United States, I would actually feel sorry for him. His moral and emotional vocabulary is so limited. Right? It's as though there's a whole portion of the world that he's incapable of experiencing and responding to. On some level, it must be very, very sad and lonely to be Donald Trump. Beset by enemies, believing simultaneously that there's no such thing as justice and that you've been unjustly treated. I could go on. This is a very sad example of what can happen to human beings when, as Aristotle says, they are devoid, of the training and upbringing that only a regard for the law can provide.
Okay, Yascha.
We've got Plato and Aristotle.
We've got Plato, exactly. I was just going to say we have Plato and Aristotle in the first 20 minutes of this podcast. I think, people are probably thinking, wow, this is so highbrow.
You started it, Damon.
I know.
So, by the way,
I will see your Plato and Aristotle, Bill, and I'll raise you by one of my favorite philosophers of the 20th century, Bernard Williams. Because one of the deep questions that philosophers have asked for thousands of years since the inception of philosophy is, why shouldn't we just be egotistical? Why shouldn't we just pursue our own interests? Why should we be moral at all? And there are different questions to this. Christian theology gives one kind of question, that there's a moral law that God has laid down. There are attempts to try and give secular the transcendental groundings for that. And Bernard Williams, in a, I think, brilliant contribution, said, look, none of this is going to convince everybody. Some people are not religious. Some people do not believe in these kind of transcendental groundings of why we should be moral. But there's another reason that actually is much more straightforward and that can potentially appeal to people irrespective of the kind of religious tradition they come from and so on. And that is to ask what kind of life you will actually lead if you don't believe in morality at all. If you don't have any sense of moral obligation, will you be capable of friendship? Will you be capable of love? Will you be capable of all of the wonderful things that come with those relationships in our lives? And I'd never thought about that essay in the context of Donald Trump until what Bill just said. But I think that I agree with him, that the life that Donald Trump is leading is a very, very sad life, because he is an egoist of a kind that Bernard Williams described, and therefore isn't capable of friendship, of love, of those kinds of deep human connections that actually make life worthwhile. And in that sense, yes, I do feel sorry for him.
It's really, really interesting. I would feel sorry for him, as Bill said, if he hadn't done so much damage. I'm afraid I'm too angry to feel pity at the moment, and also his personal defects do not account for how he was able to hijack an entire political party. But we'll come back to that, I'm sure. Okay, let us move now to the other big blockbuster this week was the Bob Woodward book. Somebody inside the White House has been giving unbelievably damaging information to the mainstream media, and that person should be stopped, except that it's Donald Trump himself, who sat down inexplicably for 17 interviews with Woodward, and they are tape recorded. Damon, first of all, let's start with that. Why do you suppose? You don't have to answer this, because I think, well, if you want to address the why in the world would he talk to Bob Woodward, please do. If not, we can move on to a different question.
Well, I have a sentence or two on that.
Okay.
It just seems obvious to me, but maybe not to everyone. Donald Trump is a man whose sensibility and outlook on the world was ineluctably shaped in the 1970s and 80s. He's very much out of that generation, so much so that a lot of what he says really doesn't make entire sense unless you lived through those years and remember where his sensibility was formed. And I think what we're seeing here is just simply he's sort of starstruck. This is Bob Woodward wants to talk to me. Ooh, I can impress him. And note that what he's gotten in trouble about so far from these interviews is stuff where he actually is trying to portray himself as like sober and sensible and informed, and not doing his usual BS routine that he saves for his own kind of the Fox News universe and Twitter and people kind of who he thinks he treats as marks, who he's trying to kind of fool all the time with his routine. He actually sits down and oh, I've gotten intelligence briefings, and oh, this virus is really terrible, and he knows that it's aerosolized, and all these things that if he actually governed over the following 6 months in light of what he says to Woodward, the trajectory of the virus in this country could have been quite different. And yet he didn't do that, because only Woodward gets the kind of the highbrow, the high level Trump, which is a great expression of the fact that Woodward was the big guy who was the one of the two journalists who brought down Nixon and Watergate, and so he's famous, and he gets on television, and he writes all these books, and all these presidents talk to him. So he was flattered that Woodward wanted to talk to him, so he did, and now helped to hang himself for the umpteenth time as a result. That's how
Yeah.
it looks to me, at least.
Yep. No, I'm glad you chose to answer the question. That's perfect. Linda, one of the things that he's getting into serious trouble about is that he told Woodward, for example, in February, in a conversation February 7th, that COVID-19 was much deadlier than the flu, maybe 5 times more deadly. And yet what he was saying in public that very same week was, when it gets a little warmer, it miraculously goes away. I think it's going to work out good. We have only 11 cases and they're all getting better. And so on and so forth throughout these many months. So that's, I think that's kind of unspinnable. What do you think?
Well, he's a con man. I mean, the fact is he thought he could con Bob Woodward. And one of the things that always surprises me about Donald Trump is it turns out he really does think he's smart and that he's smarter than other people. It always surprises me. I don't know why I'm surprised, but I am.
Me too.
And he thinks he's smarter than Bob Woodward. And so, he tries to con him, and he obviously thinks he's smarter than all the rubes that come to his, various rallies, campaign rallies. So he knows he can con them. I mean, he was doing it again this week on the wall. Remember how I told you Mexico would pay for the wall? Well, we got toll booths, so we're going to be collecting tolls, and they are going to be paying. I mean, he's a con man. But what is so upsetting about all of this, Mona, is if you talk to people who are Trump supporters, and I still have friends and family who support Trump, they discount it all. One old contact of mine who used to appear on a radio show I used to do, and who's a retired Army officer, was warning about the Atlantic piece the day before it came out. I guess people knew it was coming out, and was saying, you're going to be hearing some things tomorrow that are not true, and it's there are going to be things that Trump supposedly said about the military, but just don't believe them. And unfortunately, it works. And I don't know how to explain it. I don't know, I am able to understand somebody who says, I really like that list of 24 or 20 or however many it was yesterday that he released of Supreme Court nominees, and I'm going to vote for him because he's going to put those people on the bench. I can understand that. I don't agree with it. I don't think it's the right decision, but I can understand it. What I cannot understand is the people who try to pretend that he is not a truly toxic influence in this country, and that he does not do the things that we see and hear him doing all the time, who want us to simply close our eyes, cover our ears, and shut our mouth. And that, unfortunately, applies to an awfully lot of people.
Yes. Bill, following up on a point you made a moment ago, I found some of the most disturbing reports in this book were Trump's descriptions of his relationship with dictators, specifically Kim Jong-un, where, I'm sorry, but he just sounds depraved. Trump, that is. He says that, describing the chemistry with Kim, he says, you meet a woman, in 1 second, you know whether or not it's going to happen. And then he boasts that Kim tells me everything, including a graphic account of how he killed his uncle. And he thrilled that Kim called him Your Excellency. That's, I'm, just in light of what you were saying a moment ago about moral equivalence, this is just mind-boggling, even for somebody like me, who has always thought that Trump lacked a moral compass, but that doesn't get close to it. This is depraved.
Well, Mona,
you set up your question to be self-answering, and I'm not sure what I can add. It's clear, Trump himself apparently, in one of his conversations with Woodward, views it as odd, in need of explanation, that he seems to get along better with the toughest, meanest SOBs on the planet than with others.
Yeah.
He regards that as mysterious.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's anything but. It's clear. It's clear that in the presence of absolute power, he himself feels energized. Perhaps by the hope or the fantasy that he too could enjoy that kind of power to position your own uncle in front of a cannon and then blow him to bits, which is the quote unquote graphic story that you referred to. And, what is, I think, most dangerous about Trump is his extraordinary affinity to power, unchecked by any and all moral considerations. And the United States should account itself very lucky, that his malevolence has been so thoroughly diluted by his incompetence.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, I think that we would have careened into an undemocratic ditch already, which we have not, thank God.
Yeah. Yascha, let's think for a minute about the people around Trump. People like Jim Mattis, who described him is apparently to Woodward. And of course, Mattis has since been very public about this and written for the newspaper and so on, he's saying he's dangerous and unfit for the presidency. Dan Coates, the former director of national intelligence, thought that perhaps Putin does have something on Trump because he couldn't imagine any other explanation for why Trump treated Putin the way he did. And people like this are patriots. They do love their country. They were worried. But for the future, what lessons can we learn about the way people like this behaved and conducted themselves during the Trump years? Did they do this wrong? Should they have spoken out immediately? Did they grant him more legitimacy by sticking it out?
That's a really good question. That's tough to answer. In part because some of the hopes that I had at the beginning of Trump's presidency on how he might be constrained by institutions and figures with institutional authority seem to have been misplaced. Which is to say that in early 2017, it still felt as though if certain army generals came out and expressed opposition to unconstitutional commands, if all of the former presidents of the United States gave a statement together warning about the illegal actions that the Trump administration is taking in some area, that might really move public opinion. It might really wake Americans up to the threat that Trump poses. And perhaps there was a short window in which that might have been the case. But I think we've learned over the last years that the rise of somebody like Donald Trump completely scrambles earlier partisan divisions. And by scrambling earlier partisan divisions, it also scrambles the ability of people who are on both sides of those political divisions to say, hey, look, we've come together on something. We should really trust that on this, because if we are able to speak in one voice, it's because something very important is going on. Instead, everything becomes polarized along the new lines, which is, here are the people who like Donald Trump on one side, and here are people who dislike Donald Trump on the other side. And what happens even to somebody like Jim Mattis, who can hardly be accused of being a secret liberal or pinko or communist or anything like that, somebody who would have enjoyed tremendous respect and prestige until quite recently in American life, Now, simply, the moment he starts to criticize Donald Trump, looks like, oh, well, it's just another anti-Trumper. What else do you expect? And so, I think there is certainly a wide range of performances from people who have mostly kept their integrity, even, because they have never been willing to work with Donald Trump, to people who were willing to try and contain the damage he might do by going into service, but have mostly kept their bearings and refused to act in deeply illegitimate ways. And Jim Mattis probably falls into that category, so I don't want to speak to the details. To people who have just been completely compromised by going into the administration or by serving Donald Trump. But how big a difference all of that has ultimately made, I must say I'm less sure about now than I would have been 3 or 4 years ago.
Bill, did you have something you wanted to add?
Normal rules of conduct make sense in normal times, but less so in abnormal times. And so while I respect the fact that people like Jim Mattis left honorably, and then held their tongues, I can't agree with it, right? Because they were obeying the normal code of conduct about people who serve a president in leadership positions. And implicit in that normal behavior was the assumption that they were in a normal situation, and they weren't. So to answer your question directly, I think people who had direct experiences and then did not speak out in a reasonable period of time after they left made a mistake. And I don't, as I said, I'm not sure I blame them for it, because in order to avoid that mistake, they would have had to shift their perspective entirely to understand that unlike any other president in our lifetime, this guy was actually a threat to the basic framework that we take for granted.
Right. Yes. Linda, Damon, that is, I want to ask you to sort of reflect a little more on something that Linda raised. Namely, you could say that Trump's attacks on the media that began right at the beginning, fake media, fake news, and so forth, don't believe anything, that all of that was laying the ground for where we are now. It was to immunize him against any damaging revelation, no matter how gross. And it remains. Do you think it worked, or is it still an open question as to whether that really worked?
Well, it's a complicated issue, because I think the root issue involved is the desire to turn Trump into a figure who is trusted above everything else. And that certainly includes the media as a major competitor to him as the ultimate arbiter of all truth. And so that comes up a lot, and it is very significant in contributing to that effort. But it doesn't end with the media. And we saw that with the reaction to the Atlantic piece, because as well as with the Woodward book, it's the same dynamic where, for instance, in the Atlantic piece, when that came out, the main thing I saw immediately online was the dismissal of it because the sources were anonymous, and the claim that of course Jeffrey Goldberg can't be trusted. Why? Well, because he edits that liberal rag, The Atlantic. And then the assertion was that because the sources were anonymous, that he just made them up. Now, that, of course, is straight Trump. That's the fake news line. He goes after anytime there's a damning report about him in the New York Times, Washington Post, or anywhere else that he doesn't like. If the sources are anonymous, he claims they're just made up out of whole cloth, as if journalists regularly do something like that. Like the idea that if you are a journalist, the idea that the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic would simply make up something and then attribute it to 4 imaginary people is really unthinkable. And there really hasn't been an example of something like that revealed. So it's not like there's a pattern to even look at. But again, I don't think it's just so. I'll say first of all that is very effective for Trump to know that most of his supporters will simply dismiss the story out of hand. But the thing is that imagine if the sources hadn't been anonymous. Say it was Mattis or Kelly or any of the other kind of high-level people who worked closely with Trump, and they did go on the record and said, yeah, Trump said this. Then Trump couldn't just say, oh, just miss it, fake news, anonymous sources, Jeffrey Goldberg made it up out of thin air. Then it would pivot to something slightly different. Then it would just be, oh, well, he's just lying. He's just made it up. It's his word against mine. And of course, you know that you trust me. And so then everyone would trust him. So again, I think the core thing is turning Trump into the only arbiter of what's true and false. And then, of course, the final line of defense always is if in the end it becomes indisputable, if you actually find a tape, like say on one of those 17 hours of tapes with Woodward, he says that about the soldiers, that they're just suckers or losers. Then we go to the final line, which is to say, oh, yeah, well, of course, what's the big deal?
Or he was joking.
Or he was joking. Whatever it is, you always just dismiss. And that's really the ultimate principle at work at all of the different stages.
Yeah. For what it's worth, I actually do think that there was an opportunity to pick up on what Yascha said. I do think there was early on in the Trump ascendancy, if more people had spoken up and had asserted the primacy of truth and certain virtues and values, I think the followers had not yet become so cemented in their cynicism and in their support for Trump that it might have had an effect. But we're long past that point. That, by the way, only applies to the Trump cult. It does not apply to people who are who think of themselves as former Republicans, which is a fairly substantial bunch of people, and it also doesn't apply to people who are undecided or independent. So we'll see. All right, let's talk now about the other stories that came out this week that sort of suggest the Trump administration is putting government, putting the state in service of Trump. So the first example I would cite is, and Linda, maybe you can take this one. The Justice Department has decided to take over the defamation suit that E. Jean Carroll filed against Trump because she accused him of rape. He denied it and said that she's not my type. That was his defense. And now the Justice Department under Bill Barr has said that was within the scope of the president's official duties. And therefore, unlike in the Clinton case where he paid all of his own legal bills in the Paula Jones case, now the Justice Department is going to defend this case.
Are we surprised? I mean, there is almost nothing that Bill Barr can do right now that would surprise me. I have never seen someone so corrupted in such a short period of time as I have seen William Barr, who I would have once, he wasn't a friend, he was an acquaintance, he's somebody I knew, and somebody I respected. So I'm not surprised. It remains to be seen, and we'll see, whether the federal judge, whom they're now trying to get to take this case, whether he'll put up with it. The idea that a defamation suit against the president, who has basically called his accuser a liar and said, as you suggested, that he wouldn't rape her because she wasn't his type, that somehow he did this in the course of his official duties. I don't know. I've read Article 2 of the Constitution. I don't recall that being in there. I don't recall, I have the right to, attack women's looks as part of my official duties. It is really astounding, but it shouldn't surprise us. And what makes it so worrisome is not this particular case. It's the way in which Barr is intervening with the Justice Department across the board on everything from claiming that there are thousands of people who vote illegally in the
Yep.
United States to um, defending every single act that this president undertakes.
And going easy on his friends like
And going,
Stone and
that's right,
yeah,
and pulling
yeah.
back in terms of Flynn and Stone and
Hmm.
others, agreeing to fire a sitting U.S. Attorney in the Southern District of New York and trying to replace him with somebody who thought was going to be more friendly.
Hmm.
I think all of this speaks to the level of corruption. I mean, he makes John Mitchell look like, a choir boy.
It makes him look like Chief Justice Rehnquist.
Yeah.
um, Actually, Bill Barr, who most people think was an excellent lawyer earlier in his career and all that, he has put himself in service to a fellow who says that Article 2 of the Constitution gives him the right to do anything I want. That's Trump's constitutional interpretation. Okay, Yascha, there's another one. The Department of Homeland Security, there's a former head of the Homeland Security Department's intelligence branch has filed a whistleblower complaint, saying that he was ordered by Chad Wolf, who, by the way, is serving illegally because he did not receive Senate confirmation. Um, but he was told by Chad Wolf to stop producing intelligence assessments on Russian interference in the election and focus instead on Iran and China, and that he should not disseminate a report on Russian disinformation that was seeking to portray Joe Biden as ailing and mental health because, quote, it made the president look bad.
Yeah, I mean, look, I have to say that I lost the patience to really engage with each of these incredible outrages a little while ago. I mean, we're in this very bizarre situation where it has just become absolutely clear to what extent the president is willing to jeopardize some of the most basic rules about how American democracy is supposed to work and what the limits of his power are, and how we ensure that we have free and fair elections. And that it has no consequences. But as long as he remains president, he is simply able to get away with most of those things. These stories are too complicated and intricate for people to care. Most Americans have made their negative assessment of the president in any case. Those who still stand by him aren't likely to be swayed by these kinds of things. And the only remedy we have left is to win the elections in the fall in a very, very clear manner and get Donald Trump out of office. So you are right that this is an especially egregious case. It would have been enough for the biggest scandal of the year or of the administration 10 or 20 years ago. At this point, it just feels like, one other piece of a never-ending stream of pieces of evidence for, the evident contempt that the president has for our institutions.
Bill, one of the things that made me a conservative when I was young was that I was very wary of government power. And very concerned that the state not have too much power over individuals because power in the hands of the state is dangerous. And that was the insight of our founders, who were very concerned about that same thing. And they devised a system that would limit the power of the state. Look, throughout our history, there have been many episodes where the ordinary person has not had the same kind of concern. But what strikes me lately is that even elites don't seem to be worried about excessive power, provided that it's in the hands of somebody they like.
You're right. And when we step back from all of these episodes, I think that we have learned the hard way, that our institutions are not as robustly resistant to usurpations of power, as they were intended to be and as we hoped they were. So, assuming that we can put this wretched episode behind us, I think we all need to think hard about how to renovate our institutions to make them more robust. Uh, there are things that were done, after Richard Nixon's administration, and some of them were even done during it, that had the effect of dragging back power from the executive branch to the Congress. Mm-hmm. I think we've reached a moment where we have to repeat that process with substantive reforms that are appropriate to our particular times and circumstances and problems. We do not have the luxury of assuming that just because Donald Trump is removed from office by the people, that the possibility or even the reality of usurpation and abuse of power has gone away. Our system has been revealed as much more loose-jointed than we thought it was. The realm, particularly of executive discretion, is much broader than we imagined. The ability of a determined executive to get his way over agency as well as congressional resistance is, to me, as a lifetime constitutionalist, astounding. And so we had better not relax if we win this election, because the flaws are structural.
Yes, well said. I completely agree. Okay, let us now turn to our final segment where we will highlight or lowlight something that we want to draw attention to. So, Damon, let's start with you.
Well, in keeping with my pattern of trying to always kind of broaden our scope of concern, let's put it that way, this was a very Trump-focused episode of the podcast. So let me go a little broader and point to some, at least one dot in the constellation of dots that can be connected about broader troubling trends in the country and the culture. This is a new poll released from Gallup, and it lists, it's the usual Gallup poll that lists kind of the public opinion approval of different institutions in American life. The sports industry now has a negative image on balance among Americans as a whole, with 30% viewing it positively and 40% negatively for a net negative 10 positive score. This contrasts with the 20 plus positive image it enjoyed in 2019. So that's a 30-point drop in 1 year, from positive 20 to negative 10. This, I assume, is a function of the kind of wokeification of the sports world in the wake of the George Floyd protests, the sort of work stoppage or strike that we saw in the NBA a few weeks ago. This is yet another realm of American culture that has been sucked into the culture wars, and it's not a good sign for the health of the country. It's a sign that areas of the country where people can kind of come to a kind of consensus to put politics aside is shrinking, and we have to be on.
Yeah, agreed. Yascha.
Look, I guess I'll try and highlight what is going on in Belarus at the moment. There's a very courageous mass movement to force the long-standing most long-standing dictator in Europe to resign from his office after he rigged elections. It is not at all clear to me that this opposition movement will succeed. In fact, two of its prime leaders have already been disappeared, and there are growing reports of real atrocities committed against the protesters. But I do think it should make us hopeful in one respect, which is that the demand for democratic governance, the revulsion at dictators, is universal. We can see it across many different cultural and geographic contexts, and will assert itself even in the face of great danger. So I'm very worried about the brave activists in Belarus, and slightly pessimistic about whether or not they will be able to build a genuine democracy anytime soon. I am optimistic about what this tells us on the global appeal of the values for which we're fighting today in the United States as well.
Yes, thank you. Linda.
Well, I was going to give a shout out to you, Mona, in your piece in the Bulwark this week about the coming landslide for Joe Biden. I thought it was a great piece, but I want to offer a sober warning. And this time I'll if people are not tired of listening to my voice after an hour here on your podcast, they can also tune in this week to the New York Times opinion podcast, which is called The Argument, to hear me talk with Chuck Rocha about the Hispanic vote. And that is a bit of an antidote to your piece, because the Hispanic vote, we hear about this every election cycle, that Hispanics, there are about 13.3 million eligible voters who are Hispanic in the United States. But they are concentrated. And three of the states in which they're concentrated are Texas, Arizona, and Florida. Arguably, all three of those are going to have very close races this time for president. Texas maybe less so, but certainly Arizona and Florida could be considered toss-ups. And Chuck Rocha, my partner in crime on the New York Times podcast, was an advisor to Joe Biden, and an advisor to Bernie Sanders, and he says that the Biden campaign is not doing nearly as well among Hispanic voters as Bernie did, and that they are not spending the resource and the time and the effort to get those voters out. And Hispanics, according to the polls, are going to vote anywhere from 20 to 30% for Trump, with Hispanic males actually, in some places, a majority of them are going to vote for Trump. So this is an important issue, and if you want to hear more about it, tune into that podcast.
Bill, I've always thought it was a mistake to give men the right to vote. You're next, Bill.
I'm next. Well, you introduced this segment, Mona, by saying highlight or lowlight. But I'm going to be a Stakhanovite this week and offer one of each.
Okay.
On the highlight side, the Washington Post about 4 hours ago released a new poll with a result that I found enormously encouraging. And I'm not being sarcastic here. 66% of registered voters now believe that they will not know the result of the presidential election on election night and don't expect to know. And a third of voters now believe that it will be 4 days or longer until they know the results. Now, the reason this encourages me is that with this expectational baseline having been reset, I think the president's effort to charge foul if we don't know on election night are not going to fall on receptive soil. Call me a cockeyed optimist, but that's the way I interpret these findings. Now, for the lowlight. I've been reading a wonderful book called The Presidents versus the Press by Harold Holzer, who's a great Lincoln scholar. And we read this about the election of 1828 between Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams. The Jacksonians began circulating the rumor that Louisa Adams was not even an American citizen. The First Lady had indeed been born in England, but at that time her father, a Marylander, was serving as U.S. consul to London, a circumstance that made her as American as her husband. The publicity reportedly sent Mrs. Adams into a depression that drove her to compulsive silk spinning. And then a page later, we learn that after Jackson's victory in 1828, he drafted no fewer than 56 pro-Jackson editors, publishers, and reporters from pro-Jackson newspapers, which is the equivalent, I think, of bringing the entire Fox newsroom into the Trump administration. So there is indeed nothing new under the sun.
Right.
May I just say that this gives me some hope that in the wake of the outrageous claims that Kamala Harris is not a natural-born citizen that have sort of been percolating on some of the more extreme ends of the internet, I'm really looking forward to seeing reports and videos of Doug Emhoff's silk spinning in the coming weeks.
Yes. But that is particularly interesting. I did not know this, Bill, and about her silk spinning. But it is interesting because one of Jackson's great grievances was that the stories that were circulated about him being a bigamist had driven his own wife to have heart failure and die young. So it's interesting that that wasn't the only wife who was damaged.
By the way,
yes.
The sad fact is that those charges were correct.
Well, that's true. Yes. I mean, it's complicated.
But there was a considerable period.
No, it's true.
During which Andrew Jackson thought he was married to a woman who had not consummated her divorce with her husband.
That is true. Yes. But that doesn't change the fact that Jackson felt victimized.
No, it doesn't.
Right. All right. Well, mine, in my continuing effort to demonstrate the ongoing destruction of what had once been a proud party, namely the Republican Party. This week we learned that Mike Pence, Vice President Mike Pence, and top officials from Donald Trump's campaign are going to attend a Montana fundraiser that is being hosted by a couple who have expressed support, yes, for the QAnon conspiracy theory. So Pence will be there in Bozeman, along with Ronna McDaniel, who is the chairwoman of the GOP, and Kimberly Guilfoyle, the girlfriend of Trump Jr., along with a bunch of others. So there we are. It continues apace. As the estimable editor of the Bulwark, Jonathan V. Last, has put it, QAnon is the new Tea Party. All right. We thank you all for listening. Yascha, wonderful to have you with us. We hope next time it can be in person. And we encourage you all to rate and review us on whatever platform you're listening to this podcast. You can reach me at mcharen@eppc.org. Love to get your feedback, suggestions, comments, and so forth. And thank you all for joining us. We will be back next week.